Kenneth Hoffman, our speaker this evening, was born in Houston, but immediately moved fairly quickly to Baton Rouge, where he was raised, and we've already done a little bit of Jewish geography here with the Lons. He holds a BA and an MA, a Master's of Arts in History from Tulane. And he led the Louisiana Association of Museums through the aftermath of Katrina, and recently ended an 18-year tenure as the Director of Education in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. I highly suggest that you visit that. He ended that tenure to take up the reins in the executive directorship of the Museum of Southern Jewish Experience. I was fortunate to meet him when he graciously hosted my family on a tour prior to the museum opening. And I was so extraordinarily impressed by all the work that he and the museum are doing that I felt that it would be wonderful for us to learn. And I really hope that you do get a chance not only to see tonight, but to go and visit. New Orleans is always a fabulous place. He will take questions. Please feel free to put them in the chat. Or I will look for raised hands and bring it to his attention. I'm going to mute myself during this and welcome Kenneth Hoffman, and thank you for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to come into your homes or your places of work and share. I was told I had 4 hours. Is that correct? Just kidding. And just share a few minutes of the story of the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience and a little bit about the Southern Jewish Experience. There are many Southern Jewish experiences, but we want to bring some of these stories to the world, and that's what we're all about. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen and put up the dreaded PowerPoint. Let's see. Can y'all see my PowerPoint? Yeah, great. Okay, so first thing I want to point out is our logo. It's the name of the museum, Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. And we put a Jewish star, a Mogen David, right in the word Southern, because Jews have always been a part of the South and of Southern history. That's what we're trying to show in the museum. The second thing I want to point out is our tagline. We didn't use Shalom, y'all. It's a great phrase. You can buy things in our museum store that say Shalom, y'all on them. You probably have a refrigerator magnet or a mug or a kippah that says Shalom, y'all. But it's been overused, so we came up with our own that really speaks to who we are as a museum. Shalom, make yourself at home. We want people to feel like this is their museum. It's a Hamish place. It's a welcoming place. You don't have to be Jewish. You don't have to be Southern. We're telling a story of a specific people in a specific place at different specific times, but in a way, we're telling a universal story about the way people navigate through their environments, going from being a stranger in a strange land to being accepted. And what does that take to do that? What does someone give up to fit in? And what do they hold on to maintain their identity? That's a very universal story. And that's what we want everyone who comes to the museum to see. But before we get into the museum, I have 3 questions. I got 3 quiz questions for you. You can just shout out the answer in your own home or in your head. So here we go. By the way, notice I found the Sarasota brewery. So, you guys are represented. Question 1, which city had the first synagogue outside of the original 13 colonies? Was it Savannah, Mobile, or New Orleans? So if you think you know, you can unmute yourself and give an answer. Nobody knows. That's okay.
Savannah.
Well, Savannah is a very old synagogue, but Savannah is in Georgia, and Georgia was one of the original 13 colonies.
Oh.
So that one's out. The answer is New Orleans, right here where I am, 1828, what is today called Touro Synagogue, a Reform congregation, but it started as an Orthodox shul, as did many later Reform congregations in 1828. So we have a great old Jewish history here in New Orleans. Question 2. Which sweet treats trace their kosher roots back to Savannah, Georgia? Girl Scout cookies, Goo Goo clusters, or moon pies?
Goo Goo clusters.
Delicious, but wrong. Girl Scout cookies. When Juliette Lowe started the Girl Scouts in Savannah, Georgia in 1907 or something like that, she asked 4 of her friends in Savannah to become troop leaders. 3 of those 4 women were Jewish women. Later, when they started selling cookies to raise money for the Girl Scouts, they went to the best bakery in town. It was called Gottlieb's. Gottlieb's was a kosher bakery. Ever since then, Girl Scout cookies have been kosher. So anyone who's ever had a Thin Mint or a Savannah Smile or a Tag Along has had a Southern Jewish experience, whether they realize it or not. The last question, which African-American musician was taken in by a Jewish family at age 7 and given his first instrument? Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, or Buddy Bolden?
Satchmo.
Louis Armstrong. Yep, Louis Armstrong.
Louis Armstrong, the Karnofsky family here in town, Lithuanian immigrants, took in or looked after a young Louis Armstrong, let him ride on the back of their rag wagon as they went through town collecting scraps. And he would toot on a little horn. And I say here that they gave him his first instrument. That's wrong. They lent him $5 to buy a cornet. And throughout the rest of Louis Armstrong's life, he wore a Mogen David necklace in honor of the kindness that the Karnofskys showed him. So again, if you've listened to Louis Armstrong music, then you know what a wonderful world this is with Southern Jews in it. So Southern Jewry, the stories, the history have been interwoven into our Southern narrative and into our national narrative. Right, now, what is the South? What do we consider the South? What do we cover in our museum? A lot of people have different ideas. For us, it's Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, a couple of Carolinas, Georgia, the great state of Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and of course, Louisiana. And the museum is in New Orleans. Different people have different concepts of what the South is. Some people think, oh, well, how come you don't do Maryland? Why are you doing Oklahoma? Some people have said, why are you doing Florida? Because Florida is not the South. Everyone in Florida is from New Jersey and Connecticut. And I'm saying that because I happen to know there's 2 people on right now in New Jersey and Connecticut. But that's incorrect. Florida has a wonderful, very old Jewish history and some very interesting congregations and characters. So, of course, Florida is included. The next question people ask me is this a new museum? Because it seems like I've heard of this place before. Wasn't it somewhere else once before? And the answer is yes. The museum was originally at a Jewish summer camp in Mississippi. That phrase right there kind of throws a lot of people off. Jewish summer camp in Mississippi. Yes, it's a camp I used to go to. I'll show you a picture in a minute. And in the 1980s, when a lot of small town Jewish communities were quickly disappearing, kids weren't coming back from college to run dad's store. They were taking their Vanderbilt and Tulane and University of Florida degrees, and they were moving to Jacksonville and to New Orleans and to Nashville and to Houston. And these little towns were disappearing, and the camp would get phone calls like with the question, what should we do with the Torahs? We're the last Jewish family in town. We haven't had a rabbi in 40 years. We're selling the building. We're selling the synagogue to the Baptist church. What do we do with all the stuff? And so the camp became a repository for all these artifacts. And they built a little museum. And it was great for the summer campers to learn about their history and heritage. But it was not accessible to the general public at all. It was very difficult to get to. So they didn't really have any visitors. They closed the museum with an eye toward finding a new place for it. And the museum has now been reborn, rebooted, re-energized here in New Orleans. Just to prove my bona fides, here I am as both a camper and a counselor at Henry S. Jacobs Camp in Utica, Mississippi, back in the last century. I used to have a lot of hair. I don't know what happened. I had children. I think that's what happened. So anyway, here we are now, today, and this is our new building. And we opened this museum just this past May. So we've only been open for a couple of months. And it's a tough time to open up during a pandemic. It was a tough time to build a museum during a pandemic, but we managed to do it. This whole building is not ours. The museum takes up about 13,000 square feet. So it's not a huge place. Lael talked about how great the World War II Museum is, where I used to work. That takes up 4 city blocks. So we're definitely not this, and it's only 2.5 blocks away from us. So we're not the same kind of shop as the World War II Museum, but we are the little museum that could. Now, we do have an option to take half of the 3rd floor of this building. And I put that in green because you guys know what green stands for, right? If we take this part of the building, then our rent goes up. And so we need somebody who wants to see their name on half a floor of a Southern Jewish museum to give me a call, and I'll tell you all about it. If you've been to New Orleans, I went up on the roof, I took this picture. You can see we are close to the World War II Museum. We're in what's known as the Museum District, the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, the Contemporary Arts Center. Behind where I was standing, about 5 blocks, is the Southern Food and Beverage Museum, which is a great place. And we're right on New Orleans' historic streetcar line, so very easy to get to, just a few blocks from the French Quarter. Great for tourists, great for locals, et cetera, et cetera. The building is old, not necessarily historic. Nothing Jewish happened there. But the building owner renovated the building, but maintained the integrity, the exposed brick, the exposed beams, so that when you're walking through the museum, you really get a sense of being in history. And just to give you an example of some of the changes we made, this is one of our galleries, gutted, obviously. Today, it has a world-class exhibit in it, which was partially designed by the same folks that designed the World War II Museum's exhibits and the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia, and the International Spy Museum, and the National Archives Museum. They've done stuff all over the world. So we were really pleased to work with Gallagher. That was the name of the company. Here's another example. This was an open air atrium in the middle of our building. Today, it's been converted. It's been covered with a skylight, and it has a beautiful exhibit about what Judaism is. I'll talk about this in a couple minutes. So what's in the museum? Let's take a little quick walk through just to see some of the exhibits. Southern Jewish history starts way back before there was a United States in the colonial period. And as a matter of fact, on this introductory timeline, the very first entry, 1585, talks about Jews in the Virginia colony. If you look at the second entry, 16, wait, I've got something right in front of it. So what does it say? 1650 something. That's when the first Jews show up in New Amsterdam, which is, of course, today New York. So you can see that Jews were in the South before Jews were up in the Northeast. And we have other items on here that show the importance of Southern Jewish communities. The first Reform congregation in the country was formed in Charleston, South Carolina. The first Jewish woman to publish a book was from the South. So Southern Jewish history is American Jewish history and American history. We talk about different waves of immigration, the first Jews being the Sephardic Jews. And of course, in Florida, I was just talking to someone from the Jewish Historical Society of St. Augustine, where the very first conversos, the crypto Jews who were there with the Spanish explorers. There's all sorts of myths and legends about them, but there are real scholarship going on to find out who really was Jewish or came from a Jewish family. So we talk about Sephardic Jews, we talk about Ashkenazic Jews who came later. In the middle here, we've got a prayer book that we have on display that is in Hebrew and French. And it's from an Alsatian Jewish family that came to Louisiana. Louisiana has a French heritage, a lot of French speakers back in the 18th and 19th centuries. And when the revolutions in 1830 and 1848 were going on, a lot of Jews left Alsace and came to the United States. Many of them came to Louisiana. If I ask 10 people to tell me what is their vision, what is their physical concept of immigration to the United States, 9 out of 10 will probably say Ellis Island. And for good reason. Millions of people came through Ellis Island, but not everybody. This is a steamer trunk from an immigrant who came through Galveston, Texas. 10,000 Jews were brought through Galveston between 1907 and 1914. And the fellow pictured here with the skimmer hat is Rabbi Henry Cohen, who was the rabbi on the ground in Galveston, meeting the immigrants, helping to place them, helping to get them on a train to go to another community, to help them get a job. The idea was to alleviate the overcrowding that was happening up in New York and other northern ports. Because when it got too crowded, then a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Semitism would start to bubble up. So the idea was, if we can divert immigrants to other ports, that will be good. So they brought 10,000. Now, you can call that a success. It didn't really alleviate overcrowding in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. But today, families in Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Kansas, and throughout the Midwest, many of them can trace their family back to an immigrant who came through Galveston. And this is, if you don't know, this is Galveston right there that I'm sort of circling. You can't talk about Southern history without talking about race, right? You can't talk about American history without talking about race. It's the blanket that covers everything. Jews owned slaves in the South. Jews owned slaves in about the same percentage as non-Jewish white Southerners. It is part of the history. We do not shy away from it. We talk about what were the stresses, what were the advantages of being white in the South, of wanting to fit in. We talk about Jews as slave owners and slave traders. We talk about Jews who fought for the Confederacy. The man here on the Confederate $2 note is Judah P. Benjamin, the senator from Louisiana. When Louisiana seceded in the late winter of 1861, Judah P. Benjamin gave a final farewell speech to the Senate, proclaiming the importance of states' rights, not just states' rights, but states' rights in order to maintain white supremacy and slavery. He came back south, and he joined the Confederate government, first as Attorney General, then as Secretary of War, and finally as Secretary of State. And he was there on the Confederate money. By the way, this Confederate bill is only printed on one side. They were trying to save ink. So, that tells you right there that economically the South was not really prepared to be able to compete with the North and their resources. Nonetheless, most Southerners supported the Confederacy. But after the war, the peddlers and merchants in the South became really important to the economy. Jews had come from Europe, where oftentimes they had not been allowed to own land. They had not been allowed in the guilds, the professional guilds. So they had honed their merchant skills and their trading skills. And they often opened small stores in little towns, maybe started first as peddlers. Every little town in the South had a Jew store, or 2 or 3 or 10. Studies have been done that show that upwards of 30 to 35% of all retail stores in the small town South in the 19th century were Jewish-run establishments. So it's really amazing how many Jewish stores there have been across the South. And of course, the South is an agricultural region, especially 100 years ago. The farmers need merchants, the merchants need customers. When the cotton comes in, the farmers bring the cotton or the tobacco or the sugarcane or the rice to the merchant. The merchant can lend seed and supply to the farmer. After the Civil War, the banking structure of the South was non-existent. And so there was an intricate relationship between the farmers and the merchants. These are some of the items we have on display. Not all merchants become department store magnates, but if you look across the South at Rich's and Neiman Marcus and Saks and Loverman and Cohen Brothers in Jacksonville, you can see that a lot of our department stores used to be run by Jewish families. Today, I think Federated owns everything, but that's just the way the economy works. We talk about becoming Southern. Once you have become secure in your business, you can start to join the Masons and the Woodmen of the world and the Oddfellows and not the Knights of Pythias, but various, the Shriners, various social orders, and Jews in the South were mostly accepted into these social and cultural organizations because they were important citizens of the town. More than 200 Southern cities in the 19th and early 20th centuries elected Jews as mayors. Galveston had 5 Jewish mayors. Donaldsonville, Louisiana, you've never heard of it, 5 Jewish mayors. The first 2 mayors of Dumas, Arkansas, where the chairman of my board is from, were Jewish men. That's an amazing thing to think about. How is it that in this tiny little Arkansas town that the first two mayors were Jews? Well, it's because they were businessmen and they cared about the city and they became civically involved, oftentimes philanthropically involved. They wanted to see the city improve, and they knew how to do it. And they were respected enough by the folks, by the voters in that town. Oh, let me show you one other thing. This quilt on the right, pay attention to that for just a second, because it's going to show up again in just a minute. This is a quilt made by the Jewish Ladies Sewing Circle of Canton, Mississippi. They sat around and they sewed this thing in 1885, and then they raffled it off to raise money for the synagogue. So it's a beautiful piece of textile history. There happens to have been a crazy quilt craze going around the country and around the world at the time. So it shows that people in Canton, Mississippi were aware and connected to the wider world. But even more importantly is the metaphor of people coming together, adding their own work, their own creativity, their own love and care to make something greater than any one of them could, to support the community. And that metaphor is part of the overall mission and story of the museum. We come into this gallery, Foundations of Judaism, with our wonderful stained glass windows from synagogues across the South. Oh, I'm doing all right. This is where our non-Jewish visitors can learn what Judaism is. In a very cursory way, we understand that, but they can learn what the holidays are. They can learn the life cycle events. They can learn a little bit about some of the texts and some of the symbols of Judaism. The Torahs here, the one that's open and unrolled is from Laurel, Mississippi. And the one that's dressed is from Port Gibson, Mississippi. When I was in graduate school at Tulane in history, I wrote my thesis on the Jewish community of Port Gibson, Mississippi, as an example of small town Southern Jewish life. And it was a fascinating experience. This was a million years ago that I did this. I actually typed it. I typed it out on the typewriter. But we also have in this gallery this wonderful interactive where you can touch the screen and take a Jewish history quiz or a Jewish traditions quiz. You can learn about the holidays. There's even a little Yiddish fill in the blank that shows people that if they think they don't know Yiddish, they're really surprised that they actually do know a certain amount of Yiddish because of the words that have spilled over into English. If they've ever schlepped a kid to soccer practice, then they know some Yiddish, and people have a lot of fun with this interactive. Into our next gallery, and we re-enter history. Now we're in the 20th century, and we talk about the suffragist movement. Southern Jewish women were very active in the suffragist movement. World War I, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, obviously, that plays a big part. We talk about Sam Zamurray, Sam the Banana Man. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of him, but he ran United Fruit Company, and with his own private army basically took over several Latin American governments to get his bananas in the ground and out of the ground. He was also friends with Chaim Weizmann and a huge Zionist. So born in Russia, but immigrated to Selma, Alabama. I mentioned civil rights. We have two galleries, one on the Holocaust and one on civil rights. They are introduced with this large mural image that you see on the left. The man there is Ernst Berinsky. He was a German Jewish professor. When Hitler and the Nazis kicked the Jews out of the universities in the mid-30s, many of them came to the United States. Many of them could not find jobs because universities here had quotas on how many Jews they could have on their faculty. So about 55 of these German Jewish professors found jobs at historically Black colleges and universities. So here's Ernst Berinsky teaching about War and Peace to students at Tougaloo College in Jackson, Mississippi. So I love this picture for what it says about two different eras, the Holocaust and the Civil Rights Movement, and this spans it very well. Now, in our Holocaust gallery, we do not focus on the events happening in Europe. We focus on the events happening in the South, Southern families trying to get their family members out of Europe before the war, Southern men and women fighting in the Army and the Navy and the Marines. The Southern newspapers, what kind of stories were they carrying to let people know what was happening and when. And then we focus on 13, since we cover 13 states, 13 individual survivors who made a new life for themselves in the South, one from each state. And we have some wonderful oral histories of these folks, not talking about their experience in the camps or in hiding or in the resistance, but talking about what it was like to move to the South, to come and show up and make a new life for themselves in this part of the world. So we've all heard survivor testimony. It can be very powerful. This is a little bit of a different take on survivor testimony, and it's very unique stuff. In our Civil Rights and Activism gallery, we pay respects to Southern Jewish women who have been active in all sorts of civil rights or all sorts of activism, from the suffragist movement to education reform to civil rights, reproductive freedoms. So again, we pick one from each of our 13 states, very hard to do, and give a little background. But a majority of this gallery is about the civil rights movement. There are stories that we're proud to tell about Southern Jews who were on the right side of history. And there are stories like the Civil War era stories that we're not as proud to tell, about Jews who stood on the sidelines and did not participate for a variety of reasons. Everything from I'm a segregationist to I believe in the civil rights movement, but I'm scared. And they just dynamited the synagogue in Meridian, Mississippi, and they just dynamited the rabbi's house in Jackson and in Atlanta and in a lot of places in Florida. And if we stand out and if we make waves, then we're going to put our own community in danger. So we talk about a nuanced and complicated situation, and that's more of that universal story of how do you fit in, when do you stand up for what you believe in, when are you not allowed to do that or don't feel that you can do that. So it's an interesting story. I'm almost to the end, by the way. You guys are doing great. I haven't seen anybody like clonk over, so that's good. We talk about small town life. I love this proclamation, and it's from Lake Providence, Louisiana, when Miss Stockner died in 1953. The mayor of the town put out this proclamation: all the stores are going to close while her funeral's going on. We're all going to go to her funeral because she was such a great citizen. So it really says something about the love and the respect that Jews, particularly in small towns, could have. Now, that's funny coming right after I'm talking about bombing the rabbi's house. And that's the two sides of the story, the acceptance and the anti-Semitism. And it's a nuanced story, as I say. We talk about Jews in Southern Jews in popular culture and how people have experienced Southern Jewry through popular culture, things like Driving Miss Daisy or Alfred Urie's play, The Last Night of Ballyhoo. And of course, since we're in New Orleans, we have to pay homage to Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras is a Christian holiday, right? It's the day before Ash Wednesday. And when Mardi Gras clubs and parades and things were starting, Jews were generally not invited or allowed. But today, there are two Jewish marching clubs. They're called crews. They call them crew, and they spell it with a K. There's Crew de Jew, and there's Crew de Mishigas. Right? You guys know what Mishigas craziness, right? And the Crew de Jew, instead of throwing beads as they march through the street, they paint bagels gold. This is a real bagel. It's painted gold and it's decorated, and they throw them out, and it's a big deal if you get a bagel. You know, it's like getting a Zulu coconut. I don't know if you know about that. So this really talks about the Southern Jewish experience on the micro New Orleans level. And it's one of my favorite artifacts. We show some pictures of some folks who are Southern and Jewish that maybe our visitors didn't realize. Kinky Friedman is kind of the more on the more obvious side, but folks like Tony Kushner, who wrote Angels in America and the screenplay to Spielberg's Lincoln, born in Manhattan, but as a baby was brought down to Lake Charles, Louisiana, and lived there through high school. So he is a Southern Jew. Larry Gordon is from Belzoni, Mississippi. He was the producer of Field of Dreams. I don't know if y'all saw the Field of Dreams baseball game last week, but he produced Field of Dreams. He produced Die Hard. Lillian Hellman, the great writer, Tony Randall. So a lot of people have been in contact with Southern Jews and maybe didn't even realize it. As we get to the end of our exhibits, you can sit down at this state-by-state exhibit, and on these touch screens, you can choose a state to explore further and see some of the artifacts we have in our collection that aren't on display. You can see some of our family legacy stories at a certain donation level right now. You can add a little story about your family. And if you push Florida, these are some of the communities that you can explore on the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities. So you can really have a good time learning about some specific places. And finally, we get back to that quilt. The final opportunity is to sit down at this quilting table and sew your own quilt square. It's all electronic. You touch the screen, you pick your fabrics, you pick your patches, you can write on it. What you're doing is you're creating your identity and your community by picking different, different patterns and different things that you like or represent you. And then you can email it to yourself and you say, I'm finished, and your square gets sewn into the middle of the table with everyone else's. And you get added to the community quilt. And what happens throughout the day is that the quilt gets bigger and bigger. It gets more beautiful. It gets more diverse. It gets crazier. It's a crazy quilt. But it shows that everybody, whether they're Jewish or not, Southern or not, has something to add to a community to make it stronger. And that is the mission of the museum. And so that's why we love when people come through and make a quilt square. Finally, I'm going to just show you our Mezuzah Society wall at a certain donation level. We send the donor a mezuzah, a glass mezuzah made here in New Orleans, and we ask them to send us a mezuzah that they like. It could be old, off of their house, off of their shul. It can be, we've gotten some that come straight from Amazon. Doesn't matter. And we put them up on this wall so that shalom, make yourself at home, really means something. What says home to a Jewish person more than, well, maybe a bowl of matzo ball soup, but a mezuzah on the doorposts of their house and on their gates, right? So most people can't say they have something on display in a museum. You know, oh yeah, I've got two things at the Louvre that they put on the wall. Yeah, it's not going to happen. But now you can really put something of yours on the wall in this museum, and you dedicate it. We have a finding aid, so you dedicate it. We have a lot of congregations who have joined the Mezuzah Society so that they can send in information about their specific congregation. So if you're interested in that, there's information on the website. Finally, and that's my favorite word, if you want to know more about the museum, you can sign up for our newsletter. Right now, we just send it out once a month, so it won't be crazy. It's called the Southern Schmooze, and it talks about new exhibits, virtual programming that we do. Our online store is going to launch very soon, so you can just go to that website and put in your name and your email address. That's all we need. And that is my story, and I'm sticking to it. So, how did I do? Oh, look at that. I left us 12 minutes to chit chat and ask and talk about questions and things.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And please, if you wish to ask Kenneth a question, please, if you can raise your hand, I will try and find you or put it in the chat. I see Sonia Fuentes says already, if you can unmute and ask your question. Sonia, I can't. Let me see if I can unmute. You need to unmute yourself, Sonia.
Do you know how?
Joel, do you know how to, can you unmute her?
No, unfortunately, I'm not able to unmute people. They have to unmute themselves.
So, Sonia, let's see. If you go click on your picture, do you have a little hand, a little cursor? And then see if you can.
Go down to the bottom left in your picture. You should see a little.
Or in the bottom left, you should see, you should see a little microphone.
It's in red with a line through it. You just click on that.
Unfortunately, we can't hear you, Sonia.
There you go.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
All right, start over.
I wrote this on the chat. Today is the anniversary of the lynching of Leo Frank. Does your museum have anything about him?
We do. We, as a matter of fact, we have a corner of one of our galleries. On one side, we have a map that we call Votes of Acceptance, and it has little Jewish stars on all the cities that have elected Jews as mayors. And that speaks to, acceptance. And on the other wall, we have a big effigy, a big photograph of an effigy being hanged. It's not Leo Frank. It is the governor of Georgia, who commuted Leo Frank's death sentence to life in prison. And there's a sign on him that says King of the Jews. And next to it, we have the text about the Leo Frank story. And after his death sentence was commuted, the mob went and broke him out of jail and hanged him. And it was a huge, it was a frightening thing, not just for the Jews in the South, but Jews all over the country. Some who had been here for 6, 7 generations and had felt like they were accepted. And then this type of violence was a big deal. And the ADL was started around this time, in part in reaction to the Leo Frank trial. So yeah, it was a very big deal.
Thank you. And Sonia, thank you for your question. Anybody else? Oh, Esme?
Uh, can you? In Mississippi, I noticed that there was a cemetery in Vicksburg in the 50s, and it seemed that there were Jews in Mississippi in the 50s. Where did they go? Because in the 60s and the 70s, there were very few Jews in Mississippi.
Well, it's interesting. So when I did this thesis on Port Gibson, the height of the Jewish community in Port Gibson was around 1910. And between 1910 and 1920, we have two things happening. We have the boll weevil, which is coming across Texas. It starts to go across all of the South, and the cotton economy really starts to suffer. At the same time, you're getting mechanization. Don't worry, I'm not going to get too geeky on you, but you start to get certain kinds of mechanization in the cotton industry that mean you don't have to have as many people. And so you have a lot of African Americans going up north to Chicago and places like that. These things combined with third and fourth generation Jewish kids going away to college. That makes a big deal. As opposed to finishing high school and then working for your dad in your dad's dry goods store, you know, Bernheimer and Sons, Levy and Sons. They go to school, they get a degree, they look back at Port Gibson or at Vicksburg or those little places and they're like, I don't know. They don't need another lawyer. They don't need a doctor. They don't need, there's no one to date and have a social life with. And I want to live in Memphis, or I want to live in Charlotte, or I want to live in Sarasota. So they start to move out. I did find through my studies of Port Gibson that a vast majority of these Jewish college graduates stay in the South. And they move to these cities that I mentioned, Baton Rouge and New Orleans and Birmingham and Houston, Dallas, places like that. But that really starts to, and it's not just a Jewish story. The small towns, a lot of people start leaving the small towns around these times. One of the big motivating factors for leaving is also not having land. If your family owns land, then you can stay and keep the land. But if your family just has a store, then that's much more volatile. That could go under in a season. So there's not as much to pass on. And of course, what do Jewish parents mostly want to pass on? Education, educational opportunities. And so for all of those crazy reasons, and maybe this was a terrible answer to your question, you start to see Jewish communities really getting smaller. However, that being said, I have a 1970 Softy yearbook. Softy was Southern Federation of Temple Youth. And it's got, you know, on the Memphis page, it shows, you know, something like 90 kids on the picture. And on the New Orleans page, there's 80 kids on the picture. But up in Greenville, Mississippi, there's like 12 kids in the youth group. And in Dumas, Arkansas, there's maybe 9 kids in the youth group. So there still were Jewish communities, but they were very quickly, you know, starting to disappear. Most didn't have a rabbi anymore. They would get a traveling rabbi to come through once a month or for the holidays. Or they had a lay leader, you know, who would lead things. Jerry Krause from Natchez, Mississippi used to drive 2 hours every Sunday to bring his daughter to Sunday school in Baton Rouge. In the South, you have to work at it. If you don't work at it, it doesn't happen. Up in New York or other places, and I love New York, it's right there. It is there for you everywhere you look. The deli is there, the kosher meat is there. The shuls are there. You got your choice. In the South, you have to make an effort. And not everyone does. And a lot of people, communities disappear. But a lot of people do make a lot of effort. And that's part of what makes the Southern Jewish experience unique.
Thank you.
Kenneth?
Actually, before, there were some people who had their hands up, and I want to make sure that I recognize them. Elaine, you've had your hand up for a while, so please.
Yes, I did. And Kenneth, I really want to thank you for an excellent presentation. I had been to Utica twice to the museum there, and you just discussed something that I thought was so important, how difficult it was for the Jews to take their children every Sunday morning to a place where they could get some education. And that was so important to the parents that I spoke to when they told us of the difficulties they had, but how important it was to them.
Thank you. Well, one of the things we talk a little bit about Jewish summer camps. And of course, there are Jewish summer camps all over the country. But in the South, they played a really important role because if you're from a smaller community, you don't have 30 boys or girls to date during the year. But in the summer, or when you're at your youth group conclave at another city, that's where you get to socialize with other Jews. And our Jewish summer camp exhibit, the way we did it, we didn't just want to show people canoeing and making lanyards. We call our exhibit Summer Camp Sweethearts. And we crowdsourced photos of people who were summer camp sweethearts, either as campers or counselors, who then got married. So we have a picture of them at camp, and then we have a picture of them on the bima getting married or with their family later. And it shows it's the Lador Vador, it's generation to generation, that summer camps in the South really helped a lot of kids maintain and grow and appreciate their Jewish identity and be able to socialize with other Jewish kids.
I know
if you're not gonna write a donation check to the museum, write one to your local Jewish summer camp.
Thank you. I'm cognizant we only have a few minutes. Joan, I believe you had your hand up at one point. I may be mistaken. If not, Al was next and then Gerard. Al, did you have a question?
Yes. Some years ago when I was doing programming in Stamford, Connecticut, we had an elderly couple. They grew up in the South. As a matter of fact, one grew up in rural Mississippi. The other one grew up in
Vicksburg.
I don't think it was even Vicksburg, but small towns, very small towns. The other one grew up in rural Louisiana. And basically, they spoke about growing up Jewish in the pre-civil rights era of the South. And they basically indicated that the way the Jews survived down there was to maintain very low profiles and not to speak out, just work hard, be good citizens, et cetera, don't stand up for much of anything. And by the way, these two people ultimately left and they went to college in the North, never to go back again to the South. But what are your thoughts on that?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, first of all, there's as many stories as there are people. So we don't want to be too generalized about it. But yes, in our Civil Rights Gallery, we have some oral histories of rabbis from the South from 1966. It was a rabbinical student's thesis to go and interview, I think, about 20 rabbis about the civil rights movement. And he promised them that he would not release any of the, recordings or transcripts for 25 years, except to his committee. So they could speak candidly. And they speak about what the community, asked of them, told them don't sermonize from the bima about this. Some not all, but some communities said. Others talked about efforts that people made behind the scenes. And then others said, this wasn't our fight. I mean, there's a complicated story about that. But absolutely, there was real fear of violence and discrimination based on association with the civil rights movement. The Freedom Riders, the young college students who came down on the buses, so many of them were Jewish, but they weren't Southern Jews. They were Northeastern Jews, idealistic young people coming down in the summer to register African Americans to vote. For a lot of the Southern Jews, that was like, oh gosh, like this, please don't. This is not going to look favorable to us. When these young Freedom Riders got arrested, sent up to Parchman Farm, which is the Mississippi prison, Rabbi Perry Nussbaum of Jackson, Mississippi, would go up and see to their well-being, minister to them. Rabbi Perry Nussbaum's house was dynamited by the KKK. Rabbi Perry Nussbaum, when his contract came up for renewal, was not renewed. So, fascinating stories, lessons to be learned. I don't know. We never want to, put ideas or thoughts into other people's heads that aren't around anymore to speak for themselves. But there's a variety of reactions that were had.
We'll have two more questions. I know Gerard was next, and then Burton, and then I want to be cognizant and respectful of everyone's time. So Gerard first, thank you.
Just a quick question, Kenneth, do you remember the year of that photo of you at Henry S. Jacobs Camp?
Yes, absolutely, I remember it. One of the counselors standing there is a guy named Robert Rube. Robert was the son of one of the rabbis in town. He then became a doctor. He lives in Chapel Hill, North Carolina now, and he is on our board of directors. So you can see that people who are involved in Jewish things in the South often stay involved throughout their lives, much like all the people today on our Zoom.
What was the year?
I think it was 76.
Okay, because our children were in that camp 77 to 79. We thought we saw a son in your picture, but I guess not.
It's a small world.
Small
Burton?
world.
Burton, if you could unmute yourself.
Thank you for this excellent speech. My comment is directed to the comment that Al Tridell just made. Al, I'm speaking to you from Stamford, Connecticut. I am about a quarter of a mile away from Temple Bethel. And the couple that you referenced a minute ago are our dearest friends, Fred
Wonderful
Goldstein and Edwin Goldstein.
Right.
She from Vicksburg and he from Alexandria, Louisiana. They met on a train, he going to Williams College, she going to Smith College. They married, and they tell the same story that you heard about their growing up years. And of course, she, who has the South imprinted upon her speech to this day, speaks with pride about her ancestors who were buried in a Jewish cemetery in Vicksburg. So Al, the world just shrinks, gets smaller and smaller. He is 90, she's 89.
Well, I hope it's small enough for y'all to come and visit New Orleans. I understand if you don't want to do it right now, you should probably wait a few weeks, maybe even a few months, but come and see us. We will take good care of you. We happen to have a couple of good restaurants in New Orleans, maybe 2 or 3. We'll pass a good time, as they say.
Thank you so much for this informative and entertaining lecture. I know that I learned a tremendous amount. And thank you all for joining us on another fabulous experience on Zoom. Thank you, Temple Beth Shalom.